Welcome back to The Line. A recent article in the Santa Fe New Mexican pointed out that our state has yet to recover from the Great Recession that struck the nation in December of 2007. Now, economists are calling these last 10 years in New Mexico the lost decade. And at present, the state's economy is in a bit better shape than when the recession hit, but New Mexico has not gotten back the more than 50,000 jobs lost during that recession, and some of our citizens are even worse off. There are more living in poverty and on food stamps, and more children and families that are receiving public assistance than in 2007. And Tom, this pattern of boom and bust here, we have talked about at this table, as you know, for years now. Oil and gas is upticking, but there was a LFC report back in December saying, look guys, let's not get too crazy and spend a lot of money here because this thing could go right off the edge of the table as quickly as it came back. The question is, where's bottom for us here? And where do the new ideas come from to get us out of this situation?
Well, wow. Okay, so
right?
I'd like to refer to my comments from 3 years ago.
Right, exactly.
You know, it's unfortunate. The Tom Coles story from the Santa Fe New Mexican, I thought he did a fantastic job. I think it's a must read to really kind of understand what how we're in this mess. The haves and have-nots of the issue in Farmington with just even a worse economy than it was 10 years ago, and the boom bust cycle down in the southeast part of the state. And the fact that Medicaid and Medicaid expansion was the single cause government investment for any job growth in the state.
That's right.
And so what that does is it sends up a lot of different red flags. As we've talked about before, is how can private sector succeed when there's so much reliance on the public sector? Federal government goes into potential shutdown, which it's not, thankfully. And all of a sudden we're like going, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? So I think that the time in the time that's left up in Santa Fe with all these increased revenues from the oil and gas industry, the legislators and the governor, they need to take a serious look at this, and I don't think that they have done that. And I think both parties are to blame because everybody's playing to the edges instead of playing to the middle to say what can work.
That's right.
They say, you know what, we need to invest more in small business, and but what do they do really to help small business?
That's right.
There's nothing.
We've heard that tune a lot.
And so I think that there really has to be some serious consideration to what not incentives, but what can we do to make New Mexico just a better place to live and to do business in?
Right, exactly right.
And I don't think there's no easy way to fix that.
That's right. A good point there. And Vic, no one's kidding themselves that you can turn something like this around in 3 or 4 or 5 years. It's going to be a multi-generational part. But to Tom's point, some long-term looking idea that everybody can agree to in the middle, that seems to be the missing part here. And now that we've got an election year coming up in the legislature, it's almost as if that idea of how to get to the middle is just not going to happen in the 6 or 7 days we've got left now in this legislature.
It's too difficult. Tom is, dead right. I mean, people are talking to the ends because they're the loudest.
Right.
Whereas 90% of us agree on probably 90% of things out there.
Good way to put it.
We've got our big issues that we don't. And, Tom also mentioned, I agree, Tom Cole did a fantastic job as always on this article, but looking at Farmington, that was really hard for me to read. Farmington has been a place that there has been the boom with the oil industry. For many years, hotel occupancy rates were 99%, And so we have to look at it. And again, we need the oil and gas money. We need to invest it wisely, but solar, wind, we are New Mexico. We're in the worst drought we've had in over 100 years. But guess what we've got outside? Sunshine.
That's right.
We've got lots of wind, trust me. I drive up and down that interstate all the time, holding on like a lunatic in the wind. Let's start thinking of other things. Let's try to, we're not trying to replace oil and gas. We're trying to make sure when we hit those busts, now Roswell's up again.
That's right.
Wait a minute, they were just down again last year after being up again. That's not sustainable. Why would business move here?
Exactly right, Rachel. You hear this from the business community all day long, so I'm sure this is a migraine that just doesn't go away. But is it time? Are you sensing that folks are willing to take more of a risk now, just to try something, invest in early childhood education, and really play the long game? But start somewhere, even if it costs us just a little uncomfortably more than we're willing to spend right now. Is there a sense of that in the business community at this point?
Boy, that is the question. One of the things that our reporting has found that concerns us so much is that New New Mexico tends to be overrepresented in the kinds of jobs that don't pay very much.
I see.
Entry-level retail jobs, for example. And we have concentrations of higher paying jobs, but they're smaller.
Right.
We don't even have enough of those entry-level jobs for the people who want them.
Right.
One of the most talked about stories we ever published, it was actually one sentence in a story when the Cheesecake Factory opened here. They got 10,000 job applications.
That's right. I remember that. That's
So
right.
what can change? I've come to believe that we're in this situation because we have an economy that's been built on people just being able to carve out a little piece of the pie for themselves. And if they have that piece, they're okay.
Right.
So those people that have that piece need to feel some kind of pain in order for things to change. I don't know what that takes, but so far, the fact that so much of our state is feeling pain has not been enough.
That's a good point. That bottom has to happen at some point. That's interesting. Michael, one of the bright spots, if we can put a candle on something, is the healthcare industry. Nursing, there's a lot of different angles. We talked about audiology earlier. There's a lot of different angles of healthcare that are working. They pay well, and the population is aging, so there is a bit of an opportunity there. From your experience in the healthcare business, are you optimistic that this could be a bright spot for us as well, or is it just not going to be enough to help the state get fully out of this thing?
Well, at this point, I think it's one of the few things we have
Right.
that is actually growing and working. I think that what we need to do is really explore what other sort of opportunities there are as relates to health, and looking at baby boomers, and I mean many people after the horrible winter in the East and some of the other conditions that other parts of the country are having, people want to be someplace that's stable and the environment is conducive in spite of the fact that we're looking at droughts. But it's still, we don't have earthquakes, we don't have
right.
tornadoes, there's a whole host of things that New Mexico, that are assets here. I think we need to look at what can we do maybe to play to the aging market and the aging population, because they also have assets as well. There are many people who retire and or at that retirement age who are looking for opportunities. So I think we need to broaden our focus and not just focus on, and we are losing young people. But what are we doing to incentivize them to stay? What are we also doing to encourage people who are from New Mexico to not leave? And what do we need to do to encourage more people to end up here in New Mexico because of the assets that we have? Clearly, we're well aware of the deficits we have. It seems to me that in New Mexico, that what we really need for folks to do, everyone, is to really kind of step back and decide on what kind of state we want.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And call forth visionary leaders with integrity that who have broad agendas that are inclusive versus exclusive. There's not enough resource, and if we just keep mincing things, it's like a cake, and everybody
Right.
gets, to your point, everybody's getting a little piece, but we're not doing anything to really have a bigger pie for everyone. And until people are visionary
That's right.
and not selfish and not narrow, the base will always be small.
Tom, interesting, that kind of circles me around the activity going on in the city right now with the new mayor. He's making some very interesting heads of department choices here. That feels like a little bit of a risk, but I mean that in a very positive way, meaning it's not the same old thing and the same old people. Like, there's new ideas that are going to be coming. I'm wondering how we spread that idea around statewide, though. That's going to be the difficulty. When you talk about a broad state with different interests in New Mexico, north versus south, natural gas is a very different animal than oil and gas, oil down south. What's that middle look like, and who picks winners and losers? I think that's one of the big problems for us as well.
Yeah, when you look at to your first point with respect to Mayor Keller, and I think he has made some very cutting-edge decisions. Economic development, Cynthia Jaramillo is now there, which I think is going to be a good move. It's a different move.
That's right.
It's a non-traditional, not a government employee, just as Gary Opedal was not a traditional employee.
Good example.
So it'll be
That's right.
exciting to kind of see. But I think what you have to, it really comes down to the people who are in the position of making those decisions to decide how much towards the middle that they really want to go.
Right.
And I'm not convinced that you go down to different parts of the state. I think the part of the state that has the greatest opportunity outside of Albuquerque is down the southern part. So when you look at Las Cruces, they're close enough to success that Governor Martinez has really pumped into in Santa Teresa. But so they can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
And I think that Las Cruces is enough of it's very much like Albuquerque as far as you have you have a Democratic mayor, you have a very Republican conservative leaning city council. So I think that they have the chance to really kind of siphon off perhaps some of what's happening in El Paso, leverage some of the success with Burlington Northern and the railroad or Southern Pacific rather, and their stuff. So I think it really comes down to the elected leaders to decide how much do they want to invest and where do they want to invest.
Right.
Increasing the roads, in making the infrastructure statewide, investing, taking some of the permanent fund to increase, to improve the roads, as well as to provide statewide Wi-Fi and, just internet accessibility. I think those would be two great steps just to kind of level the playing field because as we've seen in the journal coverage and other newspapers and media is that, we have parts of our state that are just now getting phone service.
That's
They're
right.
just don't even have running water yet.
That's right.
And again, it's just how do we take care of the most vulnerable residents?
At some point, we have to write a check.
Yeah.
And it's really that simple. Things need to be paid for. Now, when we come back to the line, we'll look at how some are framing the conversation over gentrification in Santa Fe.